I believe we are ready for closing statement on behalf of the defendant, Ms. Branstad.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court?
Counsel.
Counsel. There are two things that the state talked about: clues and an evidence-based investigation. Well, let's talk first about clues. And I'm not making light of this in any way. This isn't a game where you try and fit together the clues. But no matter what, all the state is telling you is look only at one set of clues. This was a case built against Jason Carter instead of a case trying to solve a crime and look at all the clues. And the terms evidence-based investigation, well, we know the state's own criminalist said, I'm not aware of any forensic evidence. So now, what are we left with? And the state has based this entire case on the statements that Jason Carter did make and the ones they say Jason Carter made. Now, the question was said, or the statement was made, well, the state hasn't rearranged these, they put the questions with them. Well, you get to look at those clips. You know that Jason Carter was in that same chair for 9 hours. And the officer testified, yes, he was being questioned and pushed and told what he was saying wasn't truthful. And then you have hours more of footage. And those clips are not in chronological order. They're rearranged to make the point the state wants to make. But let's look at just a few of those statements. Mr. Bohl opened by saying she would have been terrified. Well, listen to that clip. What the officer says right before that is, she was for someone who seems to be such a kind and gentle person, and he says she would have been terrified. And you can listen to it and put whichever interpretation you believe is appropriate. The state talked about the statement, the text to Charles Smith, and that Jason Carter said he said 10-4. Well, you have the other texts, and Charles Smith had said 10-4 at different times. But Jason Carter didn't assert that's exactly what happened. Before that, he said, I don't even remember if I called him or had a text with him. But after he gets pushed and pushed and pushed to, now what happened, he's like, oh, okay, he said 10-4. Well, this is in 9 hours of questioning, and he references something that happened the day before. The state says this was some sort of staging. He was trying to cover his tracks. How does that cover your tracks? He's handing over his phone. He knows the state's going to read his phone. It's just a mistake. And really, what this comes down to is the minute Jason Carter finds his mother dead, his response, which may be different than my response, or another person's response, is to start thinking, what happened, what happened, what happened? And you see that as you go through this entire amount of evidence. He is the one looking around for all the clues. The state points to this tiny piece, I agree, tiny piece of a bullet and says, well, he knew something. No, the shooter in this case wouldn't know where this tiny piece went. You know who knew it? Someone who's just looking and looking and looking and trying to find answers. The state, or I think it was Jana Lane, pointed out that Jason Carter also found a container of shells and some old rusty spent casings, and it was thing after thing. The state entered the Google documents in order to show that Jason Carter set up Carter Farms a month before his mother's death. Somehow, like there was some sort of plan he was going to take over the farms, even though it clearly says Carter Farms on his own truck. or not looked up, but made an email with that. But the thing that's more interesting in that is the search history. Because if you look at the search history, you'll see before his mother's death, Jason Carter's looking up a couple funny videos, a lot of weather, a lot of farm-related information, equipment and prices, news. After his mother's death, he's looking up someone else who's been shot. A gun, a single-barrel shotgun, presumably from whatever else he's looking at. But certainly, when we're saying he knew, when the state's asserting that Jason Carter knew the weapon was a rifle, why would he be looking something else except trying to find out? And he's looking up whether or not you can buy satellite images of a specific day. Does any of this look like someone who's plotting a murder beforehand or trying to cover up afterwards, or does it look like someone who's trying to find answers? Also, Jana Lane stated that when they were looking through the basement, Jason was the one who said, "Don't touch anything." And he's looking around trying to figure it out. The state asserts that Jason Carter had all the answers, but the evidence really says Jason Carter was looking for answers. Now, if you take things out of context, you could build a case against almost anyone in this matter. There are no answers yet. Billy Carter. No one denies. Billy Carter shows up on the scene and immediately says, "I hope it wasn't the .270, which we later find out is missing and unaccounted for. There are also statements that Billy Carter makes that he admits are untrue. And his statements that are about Jason Carter and this whole rack another round comment don't happen until weeks later. His only alibi is that he checked into work. Could make a case against Billy Carter, and I bet if Billy Carter sat in a chair for 9 hours, could find some other statements. Could make a case against Bill Carter. He's made different statements. He actually has financial motive. He is the one who would inherit. The only reason that we had Jeremy McCormick testify is to show that statements can be wrong or forgotten. Bill Carter testified that in 50 years he'd only spent one night away from Shirley Carter. They'd never slept apart other than one night. Well, we now know there were at least 12 to 15 more. If Bill Carter had been the one who found Shirley Carter, and we have a financial motive, and now we can show that he said something that's not true, it could have been Bill Carter sitting in the defendant's chair. And let's look at all the other leads that weren't followed. There were so many statements made about 3 individuals who don't have an alibi. Don't think for 1 second that there couldn't have been more done to establish. Agent Ludwig sat up here and he said, well, these kind of people couch surf or don't have jobs. He didn't say specifically any of these people, the individuals that we're talking about didn't. It was just sort of a generalization of people within that crowd. Well, we've established these people did have cell phones. Where was the follow-up to those leads? Additionally, and I'm going to put a graphic in front of you, I think one of the things you'll hear is that between the time that those leads came in and there was some work initially, there was virtually no work in 2017 for a year. Of those major witnesses that we talked about, there was not one reference to a follow-up investigation or to any type of interviews or work on those leads for all of 2017. And Agent Ludwig said, I have all this paper and more. Look at all these interviews I've done. It's been hundreds. It's a murder investigation. Who in the world thought it wouldn't take work and investigation and follow-up and interviews and following what the clues lead to? But instead, only the clues surrounding Jason Carter were followed. And those clues are only statements that were made by someone who was clearly guessing and grasping and trying to figure things out. When Jason Carter guesses correctly, it's stuff only the murderer could know. And when he guesses incorrectly, it's just covering up. Everything he says can fall into one of these two categories. Either it's right and only the murderer would know, or it's wrong and it's covering up and pretending he doesn't know. I just can't stress enough to say it's an evidence-based investigation and an evidence-based case when there is no DNA evidence, no fingerprint evidence, no ballistic evidence, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. When their own...
May we approach? You may.
Criminalist Halverson said, not just on behalf of himself, but on behalf of the laboratory, he was unaware of any forensic evidence that in any way implicated Jason Carter. Now, the state talked about what Mr. Murillo said, and he said, looking at that hole, you wouldn't know anything. And I believe the end of that, and again, we go to your memory, but I believe the end of that was, except it was a gun capable of making a hole like that, which is exactly what's been said. You've got a refrigerator. It's made out of metal. It's not going to make a hole all the way through it from many types of weapons. There are some limitations there. Mr. Bull was right. We do agree about a lot of the timeline. And I don't know how much you can see because it's a little bit of a distance away here. But what I will tell you is these green lines represent the drive times. And I'm going to start with saying I don't think anyone's disagreeing that Jason Carter left in the morning and took his son to school, that he drove to the Heberlin farm, that he drives from the Heberlin farm to Casey's in Pleasantville, and that he got a donut and water and gas. And the state said there's some revelation coming about this small can of gas. Well, ask yourself, does it really sound like hiding something if someone says, I went to Casey's, a gas station, I got water and I got a donut, if they also got gas? And I'm guessing that the state's going to come up with some guesses as to what that gas could have been used for. I'll make my own guess. Putting into a bigger gas-powered weed eater and using that to clear brush near bends. That's one thing that it could be used for. There are all sorts of things that that could be used for. But moving on. Driving from Casey's and at Cargill, and these are established times. So now we get to that drive back. And that's really, the state has made a very big deal about this. Well, Jason Carter did the drive with the video. No one's disputing that. Now the question is, did Jason Carter somehow artificially inflate the time? Now, first of all, the fact that there was a slow, medium, and fast, Mr. Bull's correct. Jason Carter has never said, I was driving right at the speed limit. Never has. He said, I go over the speed limit by some amount. And I think his words within the evidence were, I don't go too fast because I don't want to lose my CDL, or however he said it. But he also gave an example of driving very quickly on that route, just to show what the parameters are. But Jason Carter says, I sent the text as I was leaving the Heberlin Farms from the driveway. And he says he stopped when he made that text. Now, the state says, well, why is he being careful all of a sudden? I think the answer may just be because he was already in a driveway and he could. And who knows? Maybe he checked in something else on his phone, took a little time, who knows? But the state's contention that Jason Carter is somehow not telling the truth about this, keep in mind again, at this point, law enforcement is taking his phone while he's having this discussion and telling him they're going to analyze his phone. Jason Carter at this point has not only no reason to lie, but would know his phone's going to be analyzed and it may pinpoint him. Now, it turns out in this case, it doesn't. And I would assert that's unfortunate for Jason Carter because he can't prove exactly where he was sitting when he sent that text. Now, depending on what you look at, it's about a 9-minute drive to his parents' place. And that puts him there somewhere around 11:04. That is a relatively short period of time. And the state made a pretty big deal about it taking 2 minutes to get from the pickup over to, or from the semi over to the pickup. I encourage you to watch that part of the video and take a look and see if that seems like an unusually long time. Because you'll get a little seasick, but it's a little bit of it moving around. But it isn't just sitting and waiting. It's walking. It's not walking quickly. Does that seem unusual? Well, then the same thing. Jason Carter gets to his parents' place. Let me just back up. Even Bill Carter said, with a semi, you let it cool down for a minute or two. So there is that time accounted for. But once he gets to his parents' place, does it really seem like an unusually long time in those 4 minutes to park his truck, maybe look around, maybe look at the sprayer, whatever he does, walk into the house, find his mother, shake her leg, look at her as long as he does, look around, and then call his sister? Is 4 minutes a long time if you're just sitting there with a stopwatch? Yes. But have you ever seen those movies where they show someone in shock and everyone's just moving around them in fast pace? Well, they just stand there? None of us know exactly what the reaction was and how long Jason stood and looked at his mother, called her name, shook her leg. You've got the receipts showing the time at Casey's. You've got the receipts showing the times at Cargill. I'm going to transition just a little bit. The state makes this allegation that Jason Carter had a plan to kill his mother. That's why he checked where his dad was. That's why he sent the text, was to start making a cover-up. Well, you can use your common sense and your observations. Watch Jason Carter walking around the morning of June 19th. The state's allegation is that's a person who's planning a murder. And the state's allegation is that he was in a hurry after he left. Certainly didn't appear to be in a hurry there. You have to close that. Now this is the 1055 text. Now, something that's interesting is in opening statement, the state said, this text looks like Jason Carter was looking at the gauge when he said that. But now that doesn't fit the narrative, because now the state's saying, well, he certainly wouldn't have had time to do that. So now it's that he wasn't looking at the gauge when he sent that text, because it doesn't fit the state's theory if Jason Carter did go look at the sprayer. And we're not saying that he did. And let's get to that particular allegation. You heard Brad Kaufman testify. When the state first asked, what did Jason Carter tell you? What he said was, he told me he was going to go start the sprayer. And then he came back around and the state said, did he tell you he greased the sprayer? And he said, he did. But that's not within any of the reports. That's certainly not substantiated. If the allegation is that Jason Carter was setting up an alibi by claiming he went to grease the sprayer, start the sprayer, either one, wouldn't he have told law enforcement that? Because that didn't come up until later. Brad Kaufman says that later. Or could that just be a mistake, much like other people have made mistakes? That Brad Kaufman heard Jason Carter say, I was going to go grease the sprayer, start the sprayer, and I decided to stop and get some food and see Mom first, and I found her like that. Couldn't that be just an honest mistake? Let's talk about the timeline. I think the state said Jason Carter waited 3 minutes. I know they said it in opening, and I think there was a little reference to it in closing. Waited 3 minutes to call his sister. You're going to have this. Or 3 minutes to call 911. Now, as we learned through Mr. Harrington, these two calls are the same call. That's why they're 2 minutes and 4 seconds in duration. This is in seconds. It got cut off from there, but the version you have says this is duration in seconds. It's 2 minutes and 4 seconds. Now, if you look at the time the call started, up here at 11:08:48, we'll do the math. It's my math, you can check it. But if it starts at 11:08:48, it lasts 2 minutes and 4 seconds, which is 124 seconds, that means the call ends at 11:10:52, and the 911 call starts at 11:11:14. That's 22 seconds, not 3 minutes. We forgot to account for the length of the call. So, this is not a direct quote. So we have, the state has asked you to accept the improbable and then find that without finding reasonable doubt. And here's what I mean by that. In order for the state's theory to be true, two things that are improbable have to happen. One, every single person who did make an analysis as to time of death, even if they've taken it back, is wrong. Because rest assured, the state has not had anyone who testified they believe Shirley Carter died after 10:30. Not one. There's no one who says they believe that time of death was later. All they're saying is all the people who say that they think the time of death was earlier are wrong or don't have the right information. But they don't have different information. So then what you have to accept is that the experts and the testimony, because Lori Goff said, I'm not an expert, but based on my experience as an EMT and an RN and a nurse practitioner, I thought the time of death was, and she varied between 1, 2, and 3 hours earlier, but any one of those means Jason Carter could not have been there. He was, by the fastest possible calculations, en route. So there are multiple people. The other thing that the state has asked you to accept is that Shirley Carter, who was a person of habit and who is diligent about feeding the pigs, for some reason waited 2+ hours to feed the pigs. Even though we don't have any evidence that she got some sort of emergency phone call, none of her friends has come forward and said, you know what, I was over there talking to her. There's no evidence of this other than Bill Carter says that he believes that the pigs had recently been fed, although he admits that it was only the gelts and they'd been sick and they hadn't been eating. And he only says there are a few different clues he looks at. But really, what makes more sense to you? Because Bill Carter said there were a few little odds and ends that weren't quite done. The pails weren't where they usually were, the hose wasn't wrapped up. And he also said that Shirley's boots weren't where she would normally put them. Well, let's put another scenario in mind. What if Shirley Carter did finish her coffee just like she said she was going to? And what if she did go down to do the chores right when she said she was going to? And while she was down there, she heard or she saw something, and she went back to the house. She went back to find out what was going on, took off her boots in a little bit of a hurry, didn't necessarily know what was going on, but she heard a car or saw something, went to check on it. And surprised people who were just starting to burglarize her house. Can we prove that? No. But does the evidence actually point more at that than at anything the state is saying? It would fit the time of death that experts have said, that people of experience have looked at. It would explain why chores weren't totally completed, and it would fit with what Shirley Carter said she was going to do anyway. We can't ignore the real evidence. This is the only physical or forensic evidence, subject to some interpretation, but this is it. The state didn't bother to look at a whole lot of gaps because they didn't finish investigating.
Your Honor, may we approach? You may.
The dark areas are where we know where people were, where there's investigation to fill in the gaps. The gray areas are where we have some information. And the white is really the unaccounted for. And I guess it's a little bit of a misnomer for both Bill and for Jason to leave those completely white, because they both say where they were. But in reality, I believe that, The officer testified that he had John Followell saying where he was too, so that would be gray as well. These gaps, these are time blocks that could have been filled in by further investigation. I have pages and pages of this statement about premature knowledge. First of all, I'm just going to throw one thing back to you. Clearly, the state and I remember something differently. Mr. Bowles said that Brad Kaufman said that Jason Carter made some sort of statement about the bedroom being in any way ransacked or touched or anything about the drawers. That's not my recollection. Rely on your own notes. My recollection is that was never said. But even if it was, and I don't believe it was, this was after Bill Carter had been back to the bedroom and after they'd all been talking. So any number of things could have been said. But Bill Carter had been in the bedroom. So then the other statement that was made was Jason Carter said he was only in the kitchen. Well, you can listen to the clips, and it is within the clips that are provided to you. It was a discussion about whether or not Jason Carter went into the rest of the house. Jason Carter says that he went outside, he went to his truck, he went on the deck, he went to the basement. It's well being questioned about whether or not he went around the rest of the upstairs, that he says, no, I never left the kitchen, and there's no evidence of anything else. There was the discussion about Billy Carter, Jr., says, was she shot in the face? And I believe Mr. Bull said that Jason Carter responds, it was in her side. You've got the video. I believe what you'll hear is it was on the side. And you can see the pictures. The blood was on the side, and her neck was affected on the side. That's pretty clearly visible. Then there was the discussion about the 911 call. Well, you've heard both Bill Carter's 911 call and Jason Carter's 911 call. If I was trying to make a case against Bill Carter doesn't ask for any help. He just calls 911 and informs them. It could be very easy if you were trying to build a case against one person or another to say, he's too calm. He doesn't ask for any help. He doesn't ask anything about helping Shirley or say her name. That could be reinterpreted. And the reason I bring that up is because if you focus on any one person, you can build a case against that one person. The state said only Jason knew that Shirley was shot. That's not true. Witnesses came in and said, I could see that she was shot. It was clearly apparent. It was apparent right away. He says, only Jason knew that it was a rifle. Billy Carter named the rifle with specifically immediately upon entering the scene. And actually, Jason Carter never said that it was his father's rifle. What he said was he wanted to look around, see if it was a gun, see if it was the rifle. And Bill Carter saw the same things that Jason did, that said it looked like a burglary. Now, the state has said this is a staged burglary. What's the evidence of that? Nothing was taken. If, and again, I'm guessing as much as the state is in some ways here, But if it had been a burglary in process, and Shirley Carter surprised someone, and then she was shot, not that it was anyone's plan, and they ran out without taking anything, how would that look different? Probably the biggest statement is, well, the gun was taken from the basement. That basement door is right by, and you've got the video, is right by the door you walk in. So would it be natural for a burglar to walk in and first go down in the basement? And what's in the basement worth taking? Old shotguns and one new, only been shot twice, I think we heard, rifle. So the burglar grabs that and it goes upstairs. And we've heard reports that, there were rumors that the burglar was looking for mailed fentanyl patches, starts digging through stuff that might have come in from the mail, gets surprised, shoots, and runs out. What evidence did Mr. Kennedy say there was of a staged burglary in this case other than that? Well, nothing was taken. That would explain that. And then he talked a lot about the shoes and the boots. And I've got to tell you, this is where I absolutely agree. Common sense plays in here. If the allegation is that staging a crime would be done by someone who, was not sophisticated, wasn't a burglar, why in the world would that person think, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to move her shoes a little bit. It doesn't make any sense to me. I listened to the testimony and I can't make sense of it. So the question is, does it make sense to you that someone would ransack some papers, move one pair of shoes a little bit, and move one pair of boots a little bit? And I'm going to jump back a little bit. I was talking about how if Shirley Carter had heard something, she might come up. Here's where it's different. If Shirley Carter was doing pig chores, which is what the state certainly is speculating when Bill Carter testifies and says the chores weren't quite done. They appear that she just didn't quite get done. If her son shows up, she has no reason to quit doing pig chores. Hey, Jason, come on down. Help me finish up. Carry this. But there'd be no reason for her to just drop everything and run up to the house. It's someone she knew. It's her son who's there 3-4 times a day, and it's his son's pigs. No reason for her to leave what she's doing. But if it was a stranger, if it was someone she didn't know, doesn't that make more sense? And we'll also talk about the fact that she was shot in the side. I don't think there's any disagreement that she was. Ask yourself this question. If a mother sees her son with a gun, the reaction isn't going to be this. Isn't it going to be, what are you doing? Wait, what's happening? Or why do you have that? Or are you going hunting? But there's no reason to assume that a mother would do anything other than just lean forward and be perplexed. Isn't that more indication of a stranger? Here are all the physical things. The investigation didn't preserve the fly eggs, which I don't know how much explanation was given, but certainly the contention of the defense is a forensic entomologist could have looked at when those fly eggs were laid by the fly, and if it's 9:15 in the morning or something around that, that's evidence. The notes and the reports that are missing, that's something that should have been expected. Labeling materials. There were admissions that there were many, many things that were mislabeled or missing from evidence. Then we heard Anna Young testify. There were unidentified fingerprints on the cards, on the gun safe. Any attempt to match those? Because I agree, a card with a thumbprint or fingerprint probably means nothing unless it's of someone who would have never had access, or if it matched the gun case. That would have been evidence that this was a burglary by a stranger. But we don't have that. The state didn't take the clothing from Bill Carter or Jason Carter or Jana Lane or any of the other people that were said to be suspects. But once they did have the clothing, Jason Carter had been told he was a suspect, packed it up, left it. The statement wasn't, well, it wasn't usable or it had been laundered. It just wasn't tested. We don't know if it would have shown anything. It might have. It might have shown at least that there was no gunshot residue, which maybe isn't all in all conclusive, but it's one more thing. I believe Agent Ludwig said he could have looked for blowback. Didn't. And then the testing. Well, then this photo. I want you to look at the date on this. It's a little bit hard to read, but I believe you'll see it's around Christmas in 2003, 12 years earlier. Jason Carter didn't remember that he had put together that, but clearly you can see 2003, and that explained the fingerprints on the gun case. Now let's talk about those cell tower records. First of all, I'm going to completely disagree with one thing that Mr. Bull said. Mr. Bull said you can either believe Mr. Valencius or you can believe Mr. Harrington. And I'm going to assert that you can believe them both. Mr. Valencius said he cannot place any matter of feet and that he uses a program that he enters his information into. Mr. Harrington, a little bit more of a computer nerd, a little bit more into the data, does it himself. They both found their conclusions and they both had some pretty valid information. But what did we find out that they didn't have? That there had already been some type of testing done. There's no report of it other than this, but it says from the crime scene, while standing in the same spot, we hit 5 separate cell towers. So we can't say, well, we thought maybe that's what Jason's record showed, or maybe this was based on something else. This is from the crime scene while standing in the same spot, we hit 5 separate cell towers, and then asking for more analysis. And we don't have that either. Now, the allegation about the cell towers is that it shows that Jason Carter went fleeing, presumably to hide the gun. That was, I think, the allegation you heard. But let's look at the time frame here. Jason Carter's phone call to 911 lasts 2 minutes, beginning at 11:14. Bill Carter's 911 call begins at 11:57, almost 11:16. But no one's disputing that Jason Carter's 911 call came from 132 Perry Street. So that puts him at 113:42, 113:42 at the end of that call. You can hear in Bill Carter's own phone call, 27 seconds in, he says, I'm turning into the driveway now. Now, Bill Carter doesn't say, and I saw Jason Carter racing back in his vehicle, or I saw him running across the yard. Bill Carter says, I was driving as fast as I could, I raced up to the house, and Jason is already on the deck. In that amount of time, if Jason Carter had gone someplace else, he'd be visible to Bill. At minimum, there'd be dust on the gravel. There'd be something. And when you look at I think it's smaller. I'll just point out to you. When you look at the map that is given to you with Mr. Valencia's report, where he shows the coverage to be, and you can do this just using the map that's provided to you and the whatever the miles asserted, it's at least 7 miles to where that next coverage place would be, by his assumptions. Now he says, well, now we're saying, well, maybe it's less than that because I don't really know where the coverage area is. But that really means the coverage area could go exactly to where Jason Carter has said he was all along. But if you use that map, it's 7 miles as the crow flies. And it's less than, now I've got to do my math again, less than 3 minutes. That just doesn't work. And then we come back to the Carter Farms, Iowa, which was the last thing the state showed you in its opening. Well, it said Carter Farms on his truck. So, and I'll just tell you generally what these are. This is when law enforcement said these people became known to them. 2016 is when you see most of these. Jason Carter gets charged, and no one gets interviewed for a year. A year. A year. I just can't say that enough. Agent Ludwig sat here and said, you know, there's only so much you can do. There's all this paper, these interviews. It's a year. People who said, I know where the gun is. It took a year. And then some. Some of them 3 years. There were people who said, I heard a confession. It took more than a year, up to 3 years to follow up. There is just no way to say that's anything other than an incomplete, unfollowed, unfair, unjust investigation. Those are all the names. 2015 to 2018. Agent Ludwig admitted in July 2018 he only vaguely knew who Callie Shin was. He only associated her with that crowd. There was a weapon taken from her father's home that cannot be excluded as the murder weapon. And the report was that that was the murder weapon, although the report of the person who delivered it is different than the weapon they took. And he didn't know who she was and didn't interview her again. It goes on and on. That many people gave information saying they could help find the murder weapon. And officers went one time and talked to the father of someone who was known to be rumored, suspected in whatever way in this case, and just asked him, could you bring out the gun? We know you have a lot. It doesn't match. This isn't just paperwork. This is a failure to follow leads and to follow real evidence. Then we have the cell tower records that Agent Ludwig said in the cell dump, Joe Sedlock's number wasn't on there, only Nicole's was. We showed him and he had to say, okay, it was. Another person, all these names. I mean, at this point, even with the 25 names that I put in front of you, I'm guessing that as a jury, you're starting to recognize the names. Why would the lead agent not know the names of the people involved in this case? And then, probably the point that is almost inexplicable here. Agent Ludwig is on the stand, and I say, you have reason to believe John Followell worked for Morris Roofing. And he says, well, it wasn't during that time frame. Remember, Morris Roofing he also admitted Morris Roofing put the roof on Bill and Shirley Carter's home. He said it wasn't during that time frame. He worked there at a different time. And then when pushed further on cross-examination, he said, well, we never asked him, meaning Jeremy Morris. We never asked Jeremy Morris anything about John Followell. But he'd already testified that it was a different time frame. And he finally had to admit he didn't have any of that information, and it was never followed up. There was one person who said there was a jail phone call with a confession. They didn't get the jail phone calls. And then Agent Ludwig just volunteers. I didn't ask. And I didn't think it was the Followells. They only have a history of violence against each other. They don't have a history of violence. And then we find out that there's a history of assault and domestic violence and I think a burglary in there. There are 2 alibis given by John Followell. Agent Ludwig admits that the people they list for alibis don't follow up. They don't say what he believes. No additional requests. No additional work to follow up on this. It goes on and on. In January 2018, law enforcement is told by one individual, Jordan Durham heard a confession. They don't interview Jordan Durham until 2019. So let's go to motive. The state has said in opening and closing, Jason Carter was feeling the stress of his financial woes. Jason Carter had a net worth of over $800,000. And that doesn't sound like financial woes. Well, if he had to pay back his note right today, and that's what he said, if I had to pay it back this minute, which, by the way, this is something he offered. He said, if I had to pay it back today, I'd be $50,000 behind, which turns out to be about right. But he didn't have to pay it back that day, and no one's asserting he did. His banker, who was called by the state, said this was kind of business as usual. There were, ups and downs, but he still had an untouched $36,000 on his credit line. Credit cards with, I can't remember how many thousand, with a zero balance. How in the world does the state make a motive to kill his mother when he won't inherit anything? Because he may run out of credit at some point in the future if farming doesn't go well? He had crops in the field. How? Shirley Carter's will is in front of you. Jason Carter wasn't going to inherit anything at his mother's death. So now, the only way the state's motive makes sense is if they say, well, and he also planned to kill his father. But ask yourself if that makes sense. Jason Carter's father could have arrived home any time. There's no allegation that someone showed up at the house or that there was an issue. If this was the actual motive, why wouldn't he? But there's just nothing that shows any of this other than guessing. There's absolutely no evidence of anything other than normal discussions, and I would assert less than most farmers. I would assert that you can use your common sense and say, how many farmers do you hear who are constantly worrying about money and thinking about it? There is so much jumping to conclusions, which is the opposite of what I think you're being asked to do. But I will tell you this. There's a jury instruction that has been read to you and will be given to you. And I have a favorite jury instruction, and it's my favorite in every case, and it's this. Try and reconcile the evidence and the testimony. And what I would assert to you is, assume every single person here has told the truth. That Bill Carter and Billy Carter and Brad Kaufman and the witnesses who give the statements of Jason Carter that are most harmful, assume they're telling the truth to the best of their recollection and ability. But then also assume all the other witnesses are telling the truth. Terry Goff and Dr. Wecht and Vic Murillo and the statements that you've heard from Jason Carter on all of those clips. If you assume everyone is telling the truth to the best of their ability, is there a verdict other than not guilty? And really, I think the evidence does lend itself to believing that everyone's telling the truth. Because although in the course of this, I raised the question of what if it was Bill, or what if it was Billy, or what if it was Jana, or what if it was the Followells and the Sedlock, in reality, the state didn't investigate enough to really have any idea. I told you in opening, it scares me to not point the finger at someone. I've read a lot of articles about how to do a trial, and I followed none of them in this case in a lot of ways, but that's probably one. It says that the juries have to have someone to point at. I don't believe that's true. And I don't believe that's true because I think that we can all look at this evidence and say, this is incomplete. This is not full information. This is a lot of people guessing because they didn't get the evidence that they should have gotten. I'm going to look through my notes and make sure I don't miss anything. While I'm looking through them, I'm going to tell you, the most difficult thing to do is to sit down and stop talking. And I say that not as a joke, not to be flippant in any manner, but I know the state's going to get up and Mr. Bull is going to say something that I'm going to disagree with. Not that it's unfair for him to say it, but just I'm going to sit here and think, oh man, I hope someone on the jury remembers this thing or remembers that thing, or here's the counter argument to that. And here's what I'm going to ask of you. I'm going to ask, when you hear those things, because I don't get to talk again, just think about, does your recollection of the evidence support those or doesn't it? Because just like the statement of Mr. Kaufman, we all have different memories, but luckily there will be 12 of you with notes and who've been listening to all of this to remember. Early in this case, I think in jury selection, one of the people in the panel, and I can't remember who, talked about tunnel vision. And I'm going to ask you, does this look like it was tunnel vision? That it was focused in? Because Agent Ludwig admitted he was laughing at Jason Carter from day one. He laughed when he cried. He didn't believe him from day one. But I will point out a couple of things. One, although the state elicited from other people that they didn't see physical tears, no one who knew Jason Carter said, I thought he was acting, or playing, or didn't mean it, including his family. The state also said that you were going to hear that this was a family that got along or that was loving. There was one witness who says that in 2014, Jason Carter made this statement calling his mother a bitch. But I want you to ask yourself another question. Does that make sense from everything else that you've heard? From all the people who know Jason Carter, who know him much better than his sales guy, who say, I heard about him talk about his mother in a loving, respectful manner. His own family said, I heard him talk about his mother in a loving, respectful manner. They got along. He was at the house 3-4 times a week. I don't think there's any question, other than this one witness. So then the question might be, what happened here? What happened to this family? Well, I don't think we doubt that Bill Carter loved Shirley Carter. His description of her was touching. It was moving. So what happens? Well, in comes Agent Ludwig, who says to Jana Lane, what if I told you that was planted? He doesn't say planted. What if I told you that I looked at the photographs and that bullet wasn't there? What if I told you? And Jason was alone, wasn't he? Gets into to her head. She's staying with Bill Carter. And then you've heard, after this division starts, Agent Ludwig talked with Bill Carter, depending on what you hear, between, I think he said 70 and 100 times until charges were filed. And then he didn't. And Billy Carter. I'm his best friend in the world. You saw Billy Carter. Billy Carter said, I just wanted to be a big shot. I just wanted to be like everyone else. That's why I said something that wasn't true. Now he's got an agent who's willing to have a beer with him. Do you wonder what happened with this family? I will say there's one thing I found offensive. Mr. Bull got up here and said that Dr. Wecht said, you can't be honest in this job. Well, you heard the quote, and I hope someone wrote it down, but my interpretation of that particular quote was, if you're honest, this job breaks your heart. It's difficult. You'll be attacked. And I think Dr. Wecht said exactly that. Yeah, I stand by that. And what happened? He gets attacked for a quote saying this job's hard and you will be attacked. But Dr. Wecht absolutely said that he gives the opinion he believes. And actually, I'll throw Mr. Harrington in that, who said, I tried not to know what I was looking for. I just wanted data. Did he make some errors? Yes. But did he own them and reevaluate and come back and say, we still have access from 5 towers? He did. The state, as you heard, was still doing investigation up until at least St. Patrick's Day while this trial was going on. And I think you heard that on St. Patrick's Day, they're still getting statements that say there are people who've heard confessions. In this case, it was Nicole Sedlock saying that she helped cover up this murder. Does this evidence say the state is really sure? That the investigator's really sure? And given this lack of investigation, the question I'm going to ask is, can you be really sure? Mr. Bull told you how he interprets reasonable doubt. I'm going to tell you, read the instruction and decide how you interpret it, because the only one who should be interpreting that is you. And at the end of this case, there are so many holes in this investigation. There's so much that isn't even explored. And in reality, the forensic evidence not only says that there's reasonable doubt, the forensic evidence says Jason Carter couldn't possibly be guilty. Shirley Carter died long before that, probably while he was at Cargill on video. I ask you to return a verdict of not guilty.